Daniel Hawley had spent so many years alone that silence had become a kind of companion steady. Predictable and easier to manage than people, his ranch stretched across miles of prairie, a place where the wind carried more conversation than any human ever did to most folks in town. Daniel seemed like a man perfectly suited to solitude. He worked hard, paid his bills, and didn't ask for help, but they didn't know the truth. Silence wasn't his preference. It was simply what remained after life had taken everything warm from him years ago. Daniel had shared this ranch with his wife, Clara. The memory of her lingered in small details he could never bring himself to erase. The faded curtains she'd sewn, the rocking chair she used to sit in, the faint scent of lavender still clinging to an old shawl stored carefully in a drawer. But the sharpest memory of all was the cradle, a small wooden cradle Daniel had built with his own hands. Carved with tiny stars and smooth rails, it sat in the storage room now, draped with cloth. Gathering dust and ghosts, Clara had passed before the cradle's purpose was ever fulfilled. The loss had carved something deep into Daniel, a hollow he carried quietly, a space he did not talk about and did not dare try to fill again over time. He learned to numb himself with routine, wake before dawn, tend the cattle, repair fences, eat alone, sleep alone, repeat. But as the years crawled forward, something began to shift. The ranch had grown larger. The work-heavier winter was creeping in earlier than usual, bringing with it cold winds and tasks that needed a second pair of hands. Daniel found himself staying up late, staring at the ledger, frustrated at all the work waiting to be done. Cooking had especially become a burden. Meals were rough, thrown together without care, and his energy for everything else suffered because of I'd refused to admit it out loud. But he needed help one morning after struggling to lift a heavy feed sack and nearly dropping it. Daniel sighed and made a decision he'd been avoiding for weeks. He saddled his horse and rode into town. The general store's bulletin board was cluttered with notices. Repairs needed, cattle for sale, traveling musicians advertising a winter show. His hand hesitated, but eventually he scribbled out a small posting. Ranch cook wanted room and meals included. Inquire at Hawley Ranch. He didn't add anything personal. He didn't explain that he wasn't looking for conversation, just competence. He especially didn't mention the quiet ache that sometimes crept into the evenings when he sat alone at the dinner table. No one needed to know that. Hiring help felt like a betrayal of the life he'd once imagined with Clara, a life full of warmth that had ended before it ever truly began back home. He tried to tell himself that the notice was simply practical. Winter was coming. The ranch needed more hands, that was all. Yet, as he hammered a loose board on the porch, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that change was coming. And change, for a man who had spent years convincing himself he didn't need anyone, was a frightening thing. That night, Daniel sat in his dimly lit kitchen, eating a plain meal he barely tasted. The house was quiet, too quiet. The wind rattled the window, a reminder of the storm season ahead. He set his fork down and leaned back, feeling the weight of his own loneliness settle in around him like an old blanket. Somewhere deep inside, he wondered if the arrival of a cook might shift the silence he had grown dependent on. Maybe someone else's footsteps would echo down the hall. Maybe laughter, soft, distant, unfamiliar, would return. But Daniel pushed the thought away. He wasn't hiring family. He was hiring help, at least. That's what he told himself. Grace Linwood had never imagined her life would narrow into a single desperate mission to find work before winter arrived. She had once been a schoolteacher, living in a small but cheerful home with her husband, Marcus. But Marcus's unexpected death, swift, tragic, and surrounded by rumors she refused to revisit, left her drifting with nothing but a tiny travel trunk, a baby on her hip. And the determination to survive the journey to Hawley Ranch had been long and cold. Grace walked most of the way, saving what little money she had for milk and biscuits for Jonah. The prairie wind tugged at her shawl, and every step felt heavier than the last, but when she'd seen the handwritten notice pinned to the general store's bulletin board, ranch cook wanted room and meals included, something inside her flickered with hope, not comfort. Not certainty, just hope. She prayed silently as she approached the ranch. The house looked weather-beaten but sturdy. Its porch sweeping wide like an open arm, smoke curled gently from the chimney. The air smelled of hay. Horses and distant pine. Jonah stirred against her chest. Whimpering, she kissed the top of his soft head and whispered, "Just a little longer." "Sweetheart." Daniel Hawley heard the knock while repairing a saddle strap at the kitchen table. He rarely received visitors, and when he did, they usually called out from the yard rather than approach the door. The knock was soft. Hesitant, almost apologetic when he opened the door, he froze not because of Grace, but because of the child in her arms. Grace's brown hair was pinned neatly despite the wind. Though loose strands fluttered around her face, her eyes carried exhaustion but also a quiet strength. Jonah, bundled tightly in a faded blanket, blinked up at Daniel with wide, curious eyes, deep, clear, and startlingly innocent. I saw your notice in town," Grace said, her voice steady but trembling around the edges. "You were looking for a cook. I can work, I can clean. I know my presence comes with a child, but if you'd consider—" She stopped. Fearing she'd already said too much, Daniel didn't speak at first. His eyes were fixed on the baby, not with judgment, but with something Grace didn't understand, something old, something wounded. Jonah reached out a tiny hand toward Daniel, fascinated by the shine of the belt buckle at his waist. Daniel swallowed hard. "You're the widow folks mentioned?" he eventually asked. Keeping his voice even, Grace nodded. "I can work hard," she said quickly. "I don't expect anything beyond room and meals, and enough pay to keep my son fed if you don't want the child around the ranch." "I can—" "No," Daniel interrupted, more sharply than intended. Then he softened his tone. "No, he's fine." Jonah gurgled in approval. As if claiming the rancher's words as a personal victory, Daniel stepped aside. "Come in." Grace hesitated only a moment before crossing the threshold. The kitchen smelled faintly of burned beans and black coffee, evidence of Daniel's culinary limitations. She almost smiled. She set her trunk down and gently rocked Jonah, whose eyes continued tracking Daniel with innocent fascination. When Daniel offered her a seat, she noticed how stiff and uncomfortable he seemed. As though unused to anyone occupying the other chairs, he asked a few questions about her experience, her health, Jonah's needs, and each answer was honest, simple and humble. In the end, Daniel nodded. "You can stay," he said quietly. "Start tomorrow. I'll show you the spare room." Grace exhaled shakily, relief flooding her limbs. Jonah giggled as Daniel walked past. Reaching again for him, something inside Daniel tightened. Something he thought he'd buried long ago. He wasn't sure what to call it yet, but Grace felt it. Jonah felt it. The ranch, empty for years, felt it too. The first morning after Grace and Jonah arrived, Daniel watched quietly from the doorway as she moved through his kitchen. The smell of fresh bread filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of pine smoke from the fireplace. For the first time in years, the ranch house felt alive. Small details mattered. A neatly folded towel, a pot of simmering stew, a wooden spoon resting cleanly on the meals counter. Daniel had never noticed how cold and empty the house had been until it began to breathe again with Grace's presence. Jonah was equally transformative. The infant's bright eyes scanned every corner, following Daniel's movements with fascination. At first, Daniel resisted engaging. He had spent years bearing the ache of fatherhood he'd never experienced. Touching a child, caring for one, felt like reopening a wound he thought had long healed. Yet Jonah's wide-eyed curiosity was persistent, and the child's tiny hand frequently reached for him, tugging gently at his coat or pointing toward the kitchen floor. Each gesture innocent and unconsciously bold, pricked at Daniel's heart. Grace noticed the subtle changes before Daniel even admitted them to himself. She watched as his posture softened when Jonah reached for him. She observed his eyes linger a fraction too long on the baby's expressions, and when Daniel offered a careful, awkward smile toward Jonah, she understood that the rancher's stoic exterior was beginning to crack as the days passed. Daniel allowed himself small interactions, lifting Jonah for a moment to calm a cry, carrying him across the kitchen so Grace could prepare meals, even humming softly to match her lullabies. Each act felt foreign, yet strangely right. The rancher who once measured life in labor and survival was now measuring moments in giggles, in gentle coos, in the warmth of a child curling into his chest. Meanwhile, Grace flourished in her role. The kitchen, once dull and utilitarian, became a place of care and creativity. She arranged herbs to dry near the window, polished the copper pots, and left a small vase of wildflowers by the hearth. The act of caring for the home mirrored her growing influence on the people within it. She cared for Jonah, nurtured Daniel, and tended the ranch house with an unspoken hope that the space could become more than shelter. It could become a home. Daniel, for his part, began noticing the smallest things. The way Grace's laugh was gentle but genuine, the way she wiped flour from her hands without a thought, the softness in her eyes when she watched Jonah explore. These details reminded him of life before sorrow, of joy he had believed forever lost with each passing day. He realized that he was no longer just observing life. He was participating in it again. At night, after the day's chores were done, Daniel would sit quietly near the fire while Grace hummed Jonah to sleep. He allowed himself to listen, letting the melodies seep into the hollow spaces of his heart. The ranch, once filled with only the sounds of wind and creaking timbers, now held warmth, laughter, and the beginnings of trust. The protective instinct he had long buried emerged gently, not as obligation, but as desire to safeguard both mother and child, to nurture life where he had once only seen loss. By the end of this week, a subtle transformation had occurred. Daniel's heart, long locked in solitude and memory, had begun to thaw. Grace had brought more than her skills as a cook. She had brought life back to the ranch, and Jonah, with his trusting eyes and innocent charm, had done something even more extraordinary. He had reminded Daniel that love, though buried, could grow again, even in a heart that had believed itself closed forever. The ranch was no longer just a place of survival, it was becoming a home. And Daniel, slowly but surely, was learning to live again. For weeks, a fragile calm settled over the Hollow Ranch. The wind still swept across the prairie, rattling the cabin's old timbers, but inside, life hummed quietly with the rhythm of cooking, chores, and Jonah's cheerful laughter. Daniel felt it every day, the subtle pull of warmth returning to his life, a sensation he hadn't believed he could feel again. He avoided admitting it, even to himself. But the presence of Grace and her child had begun to rekindle something he thought was buried. Hope. Grace, too, began to feel safe. The ranch, once a cold and intimidating place, now offered her shelter, work, and the beginnings of trust. She had grown accustomed to the routines of the household, and her careful attention to detail made the cabin feel lived in and vibrant. Jonah thrived under their combined care, his eyes sparkling with curiosity and his laughter echoing through the empty spaces that once felt desolate. But beneath the calm, the past lingered like a shadow. Grace had buried much of her history when she left her hometown after her husband's death. The circumstances of his passing were complicated, leaving behind debts, questions, and men who believed she possessed information or something valuable that could solve their problems. She had hoped the prairie's vastness and Daniel's isolation would shield her. But rumors in the town reached him faster than she expected. Daniel overheard it first while in town, At the general store, whispers of a widow connected to debts and mysterious dealings had traveled like wildfire. Daniel's jaw tightened. He understood immediately. Grace's life was more complicated than he'd realized, and danger could follow her to his doorstep for the first time. He felt something he hadn't in years, fear not for himself, but for those he had come to care about deeply when he returned to the ranch. He confronted Grace gently, but directly he asked her to explain. To tell him the truth about her husband and why she had fled. Grace hesitated, her eyes filling with shame and anxiety. For months she had carried the weight of secrets, protecting herself and Jonah by remaining quiet, but Daniel's steady gaze, full of concern and trust, encouraged her to speak. She revealed the truth. Her husband had left behind debts to dangerous men who might come looking for her, believing she had knowledge or means to settle old scores. Revelation struck Daniel deeply. He had thought he was prepared to care for her, to offer a home and safety, but he had not anticipated danger arriving on his quiet prairie. Fear for Grace and Jonah gripped him, tightening his chest and sharpening his senses. The protective instincts he had buried along with his own heartache surged to the surface. He realized that he cared for them far more than he had admitted even to himself, and that he would go to any lengths to keep them safe. Grace, meanwhile, struggled with shame and fear. She had hoped to offer Daniel only her skills and her son, not danger or complications. The thought of dragging him into a web of old debts and threats made her consider leaving. She began quietly packing, intending to disappear before harm reached him or Jonah. But Jonah, sensing tension, crawled into Daniel's lap, his innocent gaze full of trust and attachment. The sight pierced Grace's resolve. She realized she could not abandon them, not because she had to, but because she wanted to be part of this new life, if only it could be safe in that moment. Both Daniel and Grace understood something vital. The quiet life they had begun to build together was fragile, and the past was not fully behind them yet. They also understood that fear alone would not define them. Their bond, now strengthened by trust, love, and shared responsibility for Jonah, had the power to face the looming threat together. The prairie stretched endlessly under a cold, gray sky, the wind whipping against Daniel Hale's coat as he stood before the cabin. He could see the faint dust clouds approaching in the distance, the unmistakable sign that danger was closing in. His jaw tightened. He had spent years in quiet solitude, but now there was more at stake than work or routine. Grace and Jonah, the small family that had slowly begun to form in his home, were vulnerable, and Daniel would not allow them to be threatened inside the cabin. Grace moved silently, her hands hovering over a steaming pot, but her mind was elsewhere. She could feel the tension radiating from Daniel even through the walls. Jonah, sensing the unease, clutched her shawl, his tiny fingers tightening in instinctive fear. Grace's heart ached for him and for Daniel, whose quiet exterior masked a deep anxiety. She wanted to do something, anything, to help, but she also understood the gravity of the situation. Daniel had to protect them. Two men arrived on the porch moments later, their eyes cold, their voices sharp with demands. They claimed to know something about Grace's late husband, hinting at debts and secrets that didn't belong to her. But their tone left no room for negotiation. Daniel stepped forward, planting himself firmly between the intruders and the woman and child he had come to care for. Every muscle in his body was taut, ready to act, yet controlled. There was no hesitation. This was his responsibility, his choice and his duty. "You will not harm them," Daniel said, voice steady, low, and filled with authority. "Turn around and leave now, or you'll face consequences you don't want." The men sneered, approaching more aggressively. But Daniel did not budge. His gaze, unflinching, held a promise. No threat would reach Grace or Jonah while he stood between them. Jonah stirred, sensing the tension, and Grace instinctively took a step closer to Daniel. It was a moment of silent acknowledgment between them, an understanding that the rancher's resolve was absolute. She had seen hints of it before, in quiet gestures, in his growing attachment to the child. But now it was undeniable. Daniel's protective instincts had awakened fully. Shaped by the bond he felt with both of them, the confrontation escalated. One of the intruders lunged forward, but Daniel reacted instinctively, blocking the man and pushing him back. Grace's heart pounded, but she did not cower. She whispered quietly to Jonah, holding him close. Her presence, calm and reassuring, strengthened Daniel's resolve. Together they formed an unspoken shield, father, mother, and child united against the threat, the intruders. Recognizing the determination in Daniel's eyes and the unexpected courage in Grace, hesitated. They were outmatched not necessarily in brute force, but in the quiet, unwavering commitment of a man protecting what mattered most. Slowly they backed away, retreating toward the horizon, the wind carrying their threats far from the ranch. When the dust settled, Daniel stood breathing heavily, the tension leaving his body in slow waves. He turned to Grace, who smiled weakly, grateful and relieved. Jonah reached out to him, his tiny hand a reminder of the stakes they had just faced and the bond that had been tested and strengthened. Daniel knelt to hold Jonah, feeling a warmth he hadn't allowed himself in years. The fear that had gripped him melted into something stronger, fierce, protective love. In that moment, Daniel realized something profound. He could no longer live in isolation. The ranch, once a place of routine and quiet, had become a home. Grace and Jonah had awakened something within him that he thought was lost hope, connection, and a willingness to fight for love and family. The danger was gone, but the lesson remained. Protecting what matters is never just about survival, it's about heart, courage, and the choice to embrace life fully. The first light of dawn spilled over the prairie, painting the Holly Ranch in gentle hues of gold and rose. After the tense confrontation with the men who had threatened Grace and Jonah, peace had returned. Though Daniel knew that life would never be exactly the same, the storm of fear and uncertainty had passed, leaving in its place a fragile but growing sense of hope. For the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to imagine a life filled not with solitude, but with connection, laughter, and warmth. Inside the cabin, Grace moved quietly, preparing breakfast while Jonah played nearby. The room smelled of warm bread, herbs, and the lingering sweetness of milk. Grace's movements were confident and natural, evidence of her adaptability and strength. She glanced at Daniel, who sat at the table with a careful, measured calm. His presence was steady, his eyes softer now, reflecting the subtle but profound changes that had taken root within him. He no longer seemed like the man who had lived for years in rigid isolation. There was a warmth there now, born from care, trust, and the bonds that had been forged through adversity. Jonah, sensing the calm after the storm, crawled toward Daniel, his tiny hands reaching for him with unabashed trust. Daniel lifted him gently, cradling him close and feeling a warmth that had been absent for far too long. The child's innocent laughter echoed through the cabin, a sound that seemed to fill the empty spaces of the ranch with life. Grace watched from the kitchen doorway, her eyes soft and glistening. She realized quietly that the man who had once seemed so impenetrable had begun to open not just his home, but his heart. Over the next days, routine settled into a comforting rhythm. Daniel took care of the ranch's work outside, while Grace tended the home and cooked meals that nourished not just the body, but the soul. Jonah grew more confident with each passing day, his laughter and curiosity becoming a source of joy for both adults. Daniel found himself looking forward to returning to the cabin after long hours in the fields, eager to hear Jonah's small voice and see Grace's gentle smile. The turning point came one evening as the sun dipped low, casting a warm glow across the prairie. Daniel and Grace sat together on the porch, Jonah nestled safely between them. Daniel's hand brushed against hers, and for the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge the feelings he had carefully buried. Jonah's wide eyes, so full of trust and innocence, had reminded him of the love he thought was gone, the love he had believed would never return after Clara's death. But now, seeing Grace's resilience and tenderness, he realized that love had not vanished. It had only been waiting for the right moment to bloom again. Grace's heart, too, recognized the depth of their connection. She had come to the ranch seeking only work and shelter for her child, but in Daniel, she had found a man capable of kindness, protection, and steady companionship. She reached for his hand, a quiet but deliberate gesture, signaling trust, gratitude, and the first steps toward a shared future. Daniel's fingers closed over hers naturally, as if they had always belonged there, a silent agreement that their lives were now intertwined. The ranch, once a place of loneliness and routine, now felt like a home, a sanctuary of love, laughter, and hope. Daniel and Grace had faced danger, fear, and uncertainty together, emerging stronger and more united. Jonah's presence had been the spark that reignited a heart thought cold and closed, while Grace's courage and warmth had nurtured it into something lasting. As the sun rose higher, casting light across the fields and illuminating the cabin's welcoming porch, Daniel and Grace exchanged a quiet smile. Their journey had not been simple, but it had brought them to a place of trust, family, and the promise of a new life. In Jonah's laughter, in shared meals, in gentle touches and steady glances, they discovered what it truly meant to live, not merely survive, but to love, protect, and cherish one another. And so, on that quiet prairie morning, a new chapter began, one filled with safety, joy, and the enduring warmth of a family forged through hardship, courage, and the simple, transformative power of love.